What if the greatest danger to society wasn't evil, but stupidity? This was the unsettling conclusion of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian and resistance fighter during World War II. Bonhoeffer witnessed firsthand how ordinary people, good, well-intentioned individuals, became complicit in the horrors of Nazi Germany, not because they were actively evil, but because they failed to think critically. In his view, stupidity was not merely a lack of intelligence, but a far more dangerous social force, one that made people passive, obedient, and resistant to reason. Unlike malice, which can be countered with ethics, laws, and force, stupidity is almost impossible to fight. You cannot argue with it, educate it, or persuade it. It simply rejects logic and clings to blind belief. Worse still, stupidity flourishes in groups, especially under authoritarian rule, where independent thinking is punished and conformity is rewarded. But Bonhoeffer was not the only thinker to warn about this phenomenon. Hannah Arendt described the banality of evil, where ordinary people commit atrocities simply by following orders. Bertrand Russell warned about the rise of ignorance in modern politics. In this video, we will explore why stupidity is more dangerous than evil and how we can resist it. When we hear the word stupid, we usually think of someone who is uneducated, uninformed, or simply lacking intelligence. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer had a much deeper and more unsettling definition. For him, stupidity is not about intelligence. It is about a refusal to think critically. A highly educated person can still be stupid if they blindly follow authority, reject opposing viewpoints, or refuse to question their beliefs. In contrast, an uneducated person who is open-minded, reflective, and willing to learn is far from stupid. Bonhoeffer made an important distinction between ignorance and stupidity. Ignorance is simply a lack of knowledge. It can be corrected with education. Stupidity, however, is much more dangerous. It is an active resistance to learning, self-reflection, and change. He believed that stupidity was not an individual problem, but a societal phenomenon. People often become stupid when they are part of a larger group, where independent thinking is discouraged and conformity is rewarded. In times of political turmoil, mass propaganda, or authoritarian rule, stupidity spreads like a virus. One of Bonhoeffer's most chilling insights was this: stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice. Why? Because while evil can be confronted and defeated, stupidity is immune to reason. You cannot debate with a person who refuses to think. You cannot reason with someone who has surrendered their ability to question. But how does this happen? Why do ordinary people, who may be intelligent on their own, become stupid as a group? To understand this, we need to look at how society perpetuates stupidity and why it thrives under authoritarianism. Stupidity, according to Bonhoeffer, is not just an individual flaw. It is a social phenomenon that spreads and takes root within communities, especially in times of crisis. While some people may naturally lack intelligence, large-scale stupidity is often a product of societal conditions. When people find themselves in unstable or uncertain situations, such as political upheaval, economic distress, or war, they seek security and simple answers. In doing so, they become vulnerable to manipulation, propaganda, and collective thinking. Bonhoeffer observed that individuals become more susceptible to stupidity when they lose their independence within a group. As society imposes certain dominant narratives, many individuals stop questioning what they are told and instead adopt the prevailing ideology without reflection. The pressure to conform becomes so strong that resisting it requires immense effort, and few people are willing to challenge the status quo. Over time, stupidity becomes self-perpetuating. People accept lies as truth, refuse to engage in critical thinking, and defend harmful ideas simply because they are widely accepted. He saw this firsthand in Nazi Germany, where ordinary citizens, rather than questioning the moral implications of the regime's actions, blindly accepted the government's narratives. Their lack of resistance was not always driven by malice, but by intellectual passivity. They surrendered their ability to think critically because it was easier and safer to go along with the crowd. Interestingly, Bonhoeffer noted that those who remain isolated from mass movements often retain their ability to think independently. Away from the pressures of collective ideology, they are less likely to be swept up in irrationality. This suggests that stupidity is not just a question of intelligence, but also a product of social conditioning. If stupidity flourishes in groups, it reaches its most dangerous form under authoritarian regimes, where it is deliberately cultivated and used as a tool for control. Understanding how dictators and oppressive systems weaponize stupidity is key to recognizing its true danger. Bonhoeffer believed that stupidity does not simply emerge on its own. It is often cultivated and exploited by those in power. Authoritarian regimes, in particular, thrive on the widespread inability of the masses to think critically. When people abandon independent reasoning and adopt blind obedience, they become far easier to control. This is why stupidity, in Bonhoeffer's view, is not just a failing, but a weapon used by oppressive systems to maintain their power. During his time resisting Nazi Germany, Bonhoeffer observed how ordinary citizens became complicit in horrific crimes, not necessarily because they were evil, but because they refused to think for themselves. The Nazi regime did not need to persuade people to commit atrocities with complex arguments. It only needed to create a culture of unquestioning obedience. When propaganda replaces reasoning and slogans take the place of moral reflection, people become passive participants in a system that enables evil. Authoritarianism does not just tolerate stupidity, it actively fosters it. The more people rely on simplistic narratives, emotional appeals, and blind loyalty, the less likely they are to challenge authority. This is why dictators often attack intellectuals, suppress education, and undermine journalism. A society that values critical thinking and open debate is far harder to control. But when independent thought is suppressed, stupidity spreads like an infection, making the masses more compliant and less likely to resist even the most irrational or harmful policies. Bonhoeffer also pointed out a chilling paradox. The more powerful a person becomes, the more likely they are to fall victim to stupidity themselves. Leaders who surround themselves with loyal followers who never challenge them start to lose touch with reality. They believe their own propaganda and make decisions based on illusions rather than facts. This creates a vicious cycle. Those in power make irrational choices, and their obedient followers accept them without question, further reinforcing a system built on ignorance. This is why stupidity is often more dangerous than malice. A malicious person at least knows what they are doing, but a stupid person acts without awareness and cannot be reasoned with. Stupidity allows injustice to thrive, not because people consciously support evil, but because they lack the intellectual courage to oppose it. But Bonhoeffer was not alone in his warnings. Decades later, Hannah Arendt would expand on his ideas with her famous concept, the banality of evil, a theory that explains how ordinary people, through thoughtlessness and blind obedience, can become agents of destruction. While Bonhoeffer warned about the dangers of stupidity, Hannah Arendt took this idea further by examining how thoughtlessness can enable evil on a massive scale. Arendt, a German-American political theorist, introduced the concept of the banality of evil after covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the key organizers of the Holocaust. What she found was not a monstrous sadistic villain, but a bureaucrat, a man who simply followed orders without deep reflection on the consequences of his actions. Eichmann was not driven by intense hatred or malice. He did not appear to be a sadist or an ideological fanatic. Instead, he was a man who refused to think critically about the role he played in a horrific system. He justified his actions by saying he was just doing his job, as if following orders absolved him of moral responsibility. This, for Arendt, was the most terrifying part of evil. It did not always come from deep-seated cruelty, but from intellectual laziness and blind obedience. Arendt's insight aligns closely with Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity. She argued that evil thrives in societies where people stop thinking for themselves. It is not always committed by radicals or extremists, but by ordinary people who conform, obey, and refuse to ask difficult moral questions. This is what makes it banal. It does not necessarily stem from demonic intent, but from a failure to reflect. This idea extends beyond Nazi Germany. Many oppressive systems, from colonial empires to modern authoritarian regimes, rely on bureaucrats, soldiers, and citizens who passively comply with injustice. Without people willing to enforce unjust policies, no authoritarian system could function. Yet, because so many people surrender their thinking to authority, the machinery of oppression continues to operate. Arendt's theory highlights why stupidity is more than just ignorance. It is a moral failing. When individuals refuse to engage with complexity, question their leaders, or recognize their own complicity in harmful systems, they become dangerous. But Arendt was not the only thinker to explore this theme. Another philosopher, Bertrand Russell, also warned about how modern society encourages ignorance over intelligence, reinforcing the cycle of stupidity. This is why stupidity is often more dangerous than malice. A malicious person at least knows what they are doing, but a stupid person acts without awareness and cannot be reasoned with. Stupidity allows injustice to thrive, not because people consciously support evil, but because they lack the intellectual courage to oppose it. But Bonhoeffer was not alone in his warnings. Decades later, Hannah Arendt would expand on his ideas with her famous concept, the banality of evil, a theory that explains how ordinary people, through thoughtlessness and blind obedience, can become agents of destruction. While Bonhoeffer warned about the dangers of stupidity, Hannah Arendt took this idea further by examining how thoughtlessness can enable evil on a massive scale. Arendt, a German-American political theorist, introduced the concept of the banality of evil after covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the key organizers of the Holocaust. What she found was not a monstrous sadistic villain, but a bureaucrat, a man who simply followed orders without deep reflection on the consequences of his actions. Eichmann was not driven by intense hatred or malice. He did not appear to be a sadist or an ideological fanatic. Instead, he was a man who refused to think critically about the role he played in a horrific system. He justified his actions by saying he was just doing his job, as if following orders absolved him of moral responsibility. This, for Arendt, was the most terrifying part of evil. It did not always come from deep-seated cruelty, but from intellectual laziness and blind obedience. Arendt's insight aligns closely with Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity. She argued that evil thrives in societies where people stop thinking for themselves. It is not always committed by radicals or extremists, but by ordinary people who conform, obey, and refuse to ask difficult moral questions. This is what makes it banal. It does not necessarily stem from demonic intent, but from a failure to reflect. This idea extends beyond Nazi Germany. Many oppressive systems, from colonial empires to modern authoritarian regimes, rely on bureaucrats, soldiers, and citizens who passively comply with injustice. Without people willing to enforce unjust policies, no authoritarian system could function. Yet, because so many people surrender their thinking to authority, the machinery of oppression continues to operate. Arendt's theory highlights why stupidity is more than just ignorance. It is a moral failing. When individuals refuse to engage with complexity, question their leaders, or recognize their own complicity in harmful systems, they become dangerous. But Arendt was not the only thinker to explore this theme. Another philosopher, Bertrand Russell, also warned about how modern society encourages ignorance over intelligence, reinforcing the cycle of stupidity. While Bonhoeffer and Arendt explored how stupidity enables authoritarianism and evil, Bertrand Russell focused on a related problem: how modern society rewards ignorance and punishes intelligence. As one of the most prominent philosophers of the 20th century, Russell was deeply concerned with the rise of anti-intellectualism, a trend where people increasingly value emotion, simplicity, and conformity over rational thought and complexity. Russell argued that society, especially in the realm of politics and media, often elevates foolishness over intelligence. Politicians who offer oversimplified solutions and emotional slogans tend to be more successful than those who engage with difficult truths. The public, instead of appreciating nuanced, well-reasoned arguments, often prefers leaders who provide easy answers, even when those answers are misleading or outright false. This dynamic encourages a culture of intellectual laziness, where people are drawn to certainty and simplicity rather than complexity and truth. He also observed that the rise of mass media has made this problem worse. In a world dominated by sound bites, clickbait headlines, and social media algorithms, complex discussions are often drowned out by sensationalism and misinformation. As a result, people are trained to react emotionally rather than think critically. They develop intellectual complacency, trusting whatever aligns with their existing beliefs rather than questioning and analyzing information. Russell's warning was almost prophetic when we consider today's digital landscape. Echo chambers, misinformation, and the decline of independent journalism have created a world where ignorance is not only tolerated, but actively encouraged. Social media platforms, designed to maximize engagement, prioritize content that provokes outrage rather than thoughtful discussion. This creates a dangerous cycle. The more people are exposed to simplistic narratives, the harder it becomes for them to engage with complexity, evidence, or opposing viewpoints. Like Bonhoeffer and Arendt, Russell recognized that stupidity is not just an individual problem, but a systemic one. It is reinforced by education systems that discourage critical thinking, political structures that reward ignorance, and media that values entertainment over truth. But stupidity does not just spread through politics and media. It spreads socially, infecting entire communities through groupthink and peer pressure. To understand this phenomenon, we must examine the social contagion of stupidity, how foolish ideas gain power simply because people refuse to challenge them. Stupidity does not simply exist in isolated individuals. It spreads like a contagious disease, infecting entire societies. Bonhoeffer, Arendt, and Russell all recognize that irrational ideas and intellectual laziness are often reinforced by social pressure, propaganda, and mass conformity. Once stupidity takes root within a group, it gains power through repetition and social validation, making it increasingly difficult to challenge. One of the primary ways stupidity spreads is through groupthink. People by nature seek acceptance and belonging. When a group embraces a particular belief, no matter how irrational, it becomes socially risky to question it. Instead of thinking critically, individuals go along with the dominant opinion to avoid conflict or rejection. Over time, unexamined ideas become unshakable truths simply because they are widely accepted. Social media has made this phenomenon even more dangerous. In the digital age, people are exposed to algorithm-driven echo chambers, where they mostly encounter opinions that reinforce their existing beliefs. Instead of engaging in meaningful debate, they surround themselves with like-minded individuals, making intellectual laziness even more deeply ingrained. This leads to a situation where people no longer evaluate information based on evidence or logic, but based on how well it aligns with their social identity. The fear of standing out or being ridiculed further suppresses independent thought. Those who attempt to challenge popular but flawed beliefs often face public backlash, social isolation, or even personal attacks. This pressure discourages intellectual courage, reinforcing the cycle of conformity and ignorance. If stupidity spreads socially, then breaking free from it requires a conscious effort to resist conformity and reclaim independent thinking. The question is, how can we protect ourselves from the social contagion of stupidity? The answer lies in fostering critical thinking, intellectual humility, and a commitment to truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. If stupidity is contagious, then resisting it requires a conscious effort to think independently and avoid falling into the traps of conformity, propaganda, and intellectual passivity. Bonhoeffer, Arendt, and Russell all emphasize that stupidity is not just an individual failing. It is a societal force that must be actively countered through critical thinking, moral responsibility, and a refusal to surrender to group pressure. The first and most important step is to develop the habit of questioning everything. Instead of accepting information at face value, we must analyze its source, logic, and evidence. This applies not only to political and media narratives, but also to our own deeply held beliefs. Intellectual growth requires the humility to admit when we are wrong and the courage to change our views in the face of new evidence. Another key strategy is to diversify our sources of information. When people only consume content that reinforces their biases, they become more vulnerable to simplistic and misleading narratives. Seeking out opposing perspectives, engaging in honest debate, and exposing ourselves to intellectual challenges can help break the cycle of stagnant thinking. Resisting stupidity also requires the strength to stand alone when necessary. Many of history's greatest thinkers, activists, and reformers, people like Bonhoeffer himself, went against the dominant ideology of their time. Independent thought is often uncomfortable, and those who question authority or challenge the status quo risk social rejection. But it is only through this willingness to resist conformity that progress, truth, and justice can prevail. In the end, stupidity is not an inevitability, it is a choice. By embracing critical thinking, questioning authority, and resisting group pressure, we can protect ourselves from becoming passive participants in dangerous ideologies. Independent thought requires courage and effort, but it is the only way to preserve truth, morality, and justice in a world increasingly dominated by conformity. The question now is, will we allow stupidity to control us, or will we take responsibility for our own minds? The choice is ours.